like about it is the way it soaks up flavours.
It's my go-to breakfast every morning.
You have the table full of all sorts of nice things, and you have a loaf of bread and good butter, and at the end everything is still there, but the loaf of bread is gone.
I don't know how to equate how much I love bread. I just think I love it a lot.
It's actually a really basic, simple food, but it's got everything for life, really.
How do we turn ground up grass into a beautiful loaf of bread? That process is so simple, and yet every single step, you skip one, you change it. You change it forever. The great thing is you get a do-over. You messed it up yesterday, that's okay, we'll do it again tomorrow.
You kind of get hooked on always striving to get that perfect loaf.
You never know enough. There's always something else to learn or something else to do.
You'll never be the same once you sort of commit yourself to something so fully. It always changes you, it always becomes a part of you.
It's phenomenal. I think bread became an archetype. If you see people walking into the bakery smelling bread, immediately ticks maybe 10,000 years of memory. So I grew up in a wood-fired bakery, which was already then a rare thing in Germany. So 1954, there were not many wood-fired bakeries anymore, but my granddad had an idea of milling and baking biodynamic bread. And it was in the 20s. Steiner, who was the guy from the Steiner schools, he had this idea that we need a clean farming system. Therefore, you need people who farm this way, who bake this way, who mill this way, without the chemicals.
You look at a label on bread and it's just full of stuff, full of things you don't even know what they are, E-numbers, preservatives, additives. Here, we're just trying to basically bring it back to the basics. You don't need much for bread: flour, water, salt, and a rising agent of some type. I think actually bread used to be classed as those 4 ingredients, but over time in the US they changed the laws, I believe, and then suddenly it can be classed as anything. You can have lots of different things in bread and still call it bread. I think the difference here is that it's just a kind of more of a natural product rather than, I suppose, a quick rise artificial bread that you can just squash down to nothing.
Bread has had such a bad rep for so many years because of all the preservatives and sugar and acids and this and that that's been put into the bread to speed up the process. But I guess commercialization just came around and people wanted it faster and quicker and more volume and bigger sizes.
All these chemicals, what are added, they are always added to get more profit or to get longer shelf life or to make the dough more machine friendly so that it runs easy through that whole huge machine process without sticking and falling apart.
I think we've become more aware of the poor quality of commercially manufactured bread. that doesn't really have much nutritional value. We've seen the days of low carb and low sugar diets, but then we've got the artisanal bread that's fighting against that.
I think people have become very conscious of what they're eating and what it's doing to your body as soon as you eat it. We tend to feel it a lot more these days. We tend to recognise, oh, I don't feel energetic. What have I eaten recently?
Yeah, there's definitely a growing need and a hunger for good quality bread, not just bread, but produce. I think people are getting back to that and realising that, hey, wait, don't need all these preservatives. I mean, bread's only meant to be flour, water, and salt.
And we've got a peel here to get it into the oven, and this is polenta that we use to stop it from sticking to the peel to get it onto the baking stone. The dough was made yesterday and held in the fridge overnight. Just gently get it out there, and using a lime, a couple of scores.
Well, there's no real secret to it. Yeah, there's only one recipe for bread, and that's use flour, water, and a leavening agent, fresh yeast, dried yeast, or a sourdough culture. That's the basics of it. When I first started baking bread, I made a yeasted bread using fresh yeast, and I hadn't even heard of sourdough. And I came across a book by a guy by the name of John Downes, who had started the Natural Tucker bread shop in Melbourne. And I was fascinated by the idea that you could actually take flour and water and mix it and let it come alive and use that to actually make bread. And it made bread of such fantastic taste and texture that that's all I wanted to do after that.
So I remember a time when sourdough was just starting to get noticed, when restaurateurs were told that their bread was stale because people didn't realise what it was. Now, you'd be very unlikely to hear that. I mean, that was sort of 5 years ago. Whereas now people are chasing the best sourdough, people are making it at home.
A guy came to the bakery and had in a little leather thing on his belt his sourdough starter. And it was like a cult where he was part of. And he said, wherever I go, then I have my sourdough with me and can make sourdough. A sourdough is a mix out of many different yeasts. If you get baking yeast, as we can buy, you get one strain which does one typical kind of bread.
A true sourdough is made with a natural starter, which is fermenting flour and water that forms a lactobacilli, and that's what rises the bread.
You mix flour and water together, and over time, over the space of a week or a couple of weeks depending, it will naturally kind of start fermenting and create like bubbles and gases, and that's what rises it. Once it gets to a certain point, you can then feed it. So it will feed it and it will rise up and it will run out of energy and rise back down again. So then you feed it again and the same thing happens. And then that's what kind of gives the rise to a sourdough loaf. You don't need any other yeast except for the natural one that's from this sourdough starter.
We make our white bread with yeast, very little to start fermentation, and the other with sourdough. It's about time, and it's the same process. You can leave the dough on its own and do the same like wineries with wild fermentation. Over time it starts bubbling because there's always yeast in the air.
Wheat, like many other food kind of items we eat, requires fermentation in order for us to digest it.
Fermenting means you apply enough heat and time to let the organisms that are in it come to life. There's byproducts from it, carbohydrates, acids that come off it that give it all of its interesting properties that we sort of coax into becoming a loaf of bread. And there's such a big profile of flavours that can come from it, from really mild, subtle, almost sweet flavours right through to dark, acidic, earthy tones.
Fermentation part of the bread, it's so nutritious that you're allowing access now to all the nutrients that resides in the flour. Like, you can live off of sourdough bread. Sugars, proteins, carbohydrates, nutrients, minerals, sodium, everything you need is in that loaf.
And I saw once in a restaurant as a writing on the wall saying it was probably way more important for humans to invent fermentation than to use fire. I think that makes real sense. Because if you think about, everything is fermented. Sausages, salamis, prosciutto is fermented. Milk is not good for humans. Milk needs to be fermented. Yogurt, cheese, whatever, endless stuff. It's always the good stuff is fermented.
Everybody has a different dietary need, but fermented foods in general, you can't live without them in order to have a good gut flora and a good digestion process, which is the whole point of eating, is to be able to digest, extract nutrition and fuel the body. Hannah had lots of health issues to do with her gut. And one of the long-term solutions was to improve our diet. And it wasn't that it was bad. It's just that the white foods were just not agreeing with her and with our household. And when a little child isn't sleeping, the whole house is unhappy. So we sort of took that approach of finding fermented foods that we wanted to be eating all the time. So sauerkrauts and kimchis and sourdough breads. Making a living out of bread is not something you set out to say, you know what, I'm going to make a fortune doing this. It just wasn't even in my thought process. What I really set out to do was share the fact that we'd solved a problem in our life, in that nutrition and in that fermentation and in that improved health. I just had no idea so many people would respond the way they did. Forbidden land, welcome to my satellite view. I've become accustomed to lately I spend my time praying for
I think when I first was like intrigued by good bread was my maths tutor. I would go around to his house and he would like have a freshly baked fruit loaf or something, and it was like, I freaking hated maths, so having a slice of fresh bread was probably the only good part of the tutoring session.
Your leaven has gone in there, and as it ferments, it'll be releasing air, and the gluten is trapping that air in so that your dough is basically inflating like a balloon. So without that gluten, the air would just slowly escape and you wouldn't get a nice, airy, billowy loaf of bread.
That gluten thing is such a big talk at the moment that it's crucial to explain that the gluten is not the devil. It's the thing what makes the loaf. That's what the gluten does. It builds glue, that's why it's called gluten, that holds the gas from what the bacteria fart. That's what they do. They fart gas and piss alcohol. And that's why you need that gluten that holds the gas. and that gives you a loaf, otherwise you don't have a loaf.
A lot of people are kind of gluten sensitive. They're maybe not allergic to gluten, obviously celiacs are, so they can't touch it, but with the sourdough process, it makes it more digestible. People that might be gluten sensitive should be okay to eat proper, true sourdough, especially if it's if the grain's been sourced from a good supplier and it doesn't have any, I suppose, nasties in it.
It's bitter taste and better for your gut. People can't eat bread, but they say we can eat yours.
I can open I can turn lights on or open the back roll door, whichever you want. So I'll just do both, eh? Okay, so it's in here. This is the mill. Let me just get some light on. Right, so we'll turn her on. So you press the little start button and you'll hear that lovely, lovely sound, and you can hear that little whooshing sound. That's because I didn't lift the stones up quite enough. So the grain will start dripping out of there. And now I'm going to be lowering the stones. So you've got to get to a point on the machine where you get that right consistency. So I know the point that I need to look for, and it's like the resistance on the power motor. And then it's just about feeling the grains. So that's actually quite a nice consistency, and that's whole wheat flour, the whole grain just being crushed up.
There's thousands of variety of wheat, and thousands of varieties of wheat can be obviously turned into flour. Some of them aren't really suitable for making bread, but there's hundreds that are. Even though you do need like a reasonably high protein, or that's the ideal, I suppose, to get that rise for your bread. I think it's more about the source of the flour and where the flour or the grain comes from.
Modern milling is a huge process where you cause a lot of damage to the actual core of the wheat. And good milling is stone ground milling, or very carefully milling. If you have no good flour, the mill usually adds gluten powder, and that's where it already starts. Then the whole thing is not natural anymore.
So at the moment it's all coming out to whole wheat flour. So now what I'm going to do is actually going to then send the grain this way. So it's all just basically using gravity to come out of here. Turn that down, stops it from coming out this chute. Now it's coming out this chute. And then it's just going into your white sifted flour. So this is like the flour you'll get, like your white kind of, well, this is what we use for the bread predominantly, and some of this stuff. And then you have what's called middlings, which is like a semolina type thing that we use for the dusting of we use it for rolling the bread in, instead of most people buy like a dusting flour. Or you have the bran at the end. What we do is we bag it up, send it back to the farm. So when I go to the farm, and they put it on their worm farm, so the worms will then eat it. Their wee will then be used on the field. So it's like the whole cycle.
A lot of places are using flour that has been milled, for example, like in Italy or something like that, and then brought over here on a boat or in a plane, and then trucked around the place. Whereas if you can get your grains from the source, the only sort of inputs has been the farmer growing the grain and then you driving it to wherever it's going to get milled.
Yeah, the nutrient that from freshly milled flour is so much better because obviously, like anything, as soon as you process any kind of grain or any food really, then it starts losing all its nutritional value. So for some reason people don't seem to understand that grain's exactly the same. They're quite happy to buy a bag of flour that's been sat on the shelf for months and months and months, and it's become what's called shelf stable, and then when it's shelf stable it basically doesn't really go off. So if there's nothing to go off, then what nutrients are in that flour?
When you have a fire somewhere it's just nice, and you want to be there, and you want to handle that fire, and you want to make it right for your bread. It gives a different way how you treat your product. What we heat is waste from sawmills. Sometimes they burn it in their backyard, so it's ecologically also makes sense.
The first recorded sourdoughs were made 2,500 BC, so nearly 5,000 years ago, when they were building the pyramids of Giza in Egypt, and they were made in wood-fired ovens.
Everyone knows if you sit in front of a fire, the warmth is different than if you sit in front of an electric heater.
There's no direct heat in a wood-fired oven. It's radiated heat from the bricks that bake. But in a conventional oven, you've got a fan blowing, or you've got a gas burner or something like that.
When it gets hot, heated in the oven, it gets super hard, but still very gentle in storing the heat and then giving it back to the bread.
Wood-fired bakeries have a small space to load through, which makes it very labour intensive and very slow, and it means that you're going to have a big variance in the first loaf coming in, and then it's the last one to come out. We use ovens that can be loaded very quickly and unloaded very quickly, so that they all go in, and maybe there's a 2-minute delay between the first one and the last one. And yet we still bake on stone, we still ensure most of the heat is coming from the base and up through the bread. We're using modern day sort of engineering, but trying to hold on to what works about a wood-fired bread, and that is a lot of the heat is in the base, in the earth, in the stone.
If we are at 1,000 loaves a day, that's capacity. And if you need more, you should have another bakery. And the same thing again, gives people work, gives people price, and not trying to grow that bigger and drive further and further. It's not necessary. and people love their bakery in their town. No church anymore, but still a bakery, hopefully.
Sourdough bread especially will always be made by a person, because there's just so many facets that a machine can't judge along the way, whether it's how elastic or extensible the dough feels that day, or the temperature of the flour that day, the temperature of the levain that day, the temperature of the water, the ambient temperature, how relaxed the dough is between different stages and that sort of thing. So yeah, I think that it's just not a job that a machine will ever be able to take over and produce this equivalent product without any sort of intervention by a person.
I think there's a connection between the baker and the ingredients and the process that is kind of magical. You can put a machine in there and it'll physically do the work, or it can take some of the labour away. But with something that's you're coaxing out of nature, like a fermentation, which is different all the time, you really need somebody to interpret it, and that's the baker's job. It's the baker's job to interpret what's happening today, what's going on with the humidity, why is this flour different? Without that skilled hand, you end up lowering the bar and just simply feeding people rather than nourishing people.
No, it masters you.
I don't think you can actually fully master it. You can become quite good at it, but I don't think you're able to actually control how the bacteria is going to react.
The bread is always different because you're relying on just wild natural yeast. You're relying on the atmosphere of the day, the temperature, the weather, everything else. So it's real by the seat of your pants bread making.
No matter how good you are, you're always, and how much practice you had, you're always going to have days where your bread doesn't go how you expected it to. And
there's been many times over the years my bake day will blow out by a couple of hours just because the bread's just creeping along and I'm having to roll it next to the oven or, you know, put the bread tub like on top of the oven just to try to get a bit of warmth in there just to kind of encourage the fermentation.
We're here in Perth, so it can be nothing for 2 or 3 40-degree days. And the first one isn't the problem, even the third one isn't the problem. It's when the temperature drops and yet everything's still hot. The water out of the tap is still hot. Actually, after a heat wave is the hardest stage to make bread. You see it on the bench. You know when you're in trouble because it's trying to fulfill its life destiny of growing before you're ready to process it into the shape you want it to be.
Making bread is kind of like a perfect balance between skill and intuition and science and theory all in the one package. You can know everything about fermentation and you can know everything about gluten structure and the thermodynamics of dough structure, but at the end of the day, probably a good recipe and intuition is gonna get you the most success.
Go under and you pick it up, smash it down, and then fold it over like that. Under, pick it up, slap it down, fold it over like that. Under, slap it down, fold it over. How long are we doing that for? Probably depends on how good you are at it. So like, you might do it for a minute if you get really good at it, or you might do it for 10 minutes. Fold it over.
Once you've got the recipe down pat, it's just basically making sure you follow it, you weigh things out correctly, you don't forget any of the processes, and then it is just like seeing as you go. It's more about feel and understanding the dough. As long as you can, if something goes wrong, try and work out why, then anyone can make bread. It's it's a lovely thing to do.
It's almost like bringing a child into the world.
It just requires nurturing. And you can't speed it up.
You've got to really put in the time.
You have to do it by hand.
Getting your hands in there.
Almost like micro movements in your hands.
The softness of the dough and the soft.
You're trying to think of the kind of layers of it tucking.
The slapping part.
When you actually feel it come together.
Smells welcoming and inviting and comforting.
It's worth it in the end to see the fruits of your labour, I suppose. Yeah.
Kitchen floor at night, slow dancing in the living room, river walking, true talking, eating mandarins outside, sunsetting, juice dripping, sky gazing, my words meant something to you.
All food is deeply personal and it's super nostalgic, and I think people will remember the meals that they've shared and that time together.
Blue
Yeah. Okay, Mama. More. You make lots of stuff. When we go over on a Sunday, it's like everything gets placed on the table. The bread's all ready to go in the toaster. Like Dad's pre-cut it and he's popped it in the sandwich press. We have Turkish bread a lot. Everybody sits down, he's like, great. He flicks on the switch and the bread starts heating up and he cuts it into these perfect little squares and hands it out. I think I started wanting to make bread for myself as a way to carve out time within my busy life. Even if it's a slow and long process, it meant that when I came into the kitchen, I could be really intentional and focused and precise with making this loaf of bread. And then you get to eat it, which is like the best thing ever. I still really love buying bread from bakeries, and my bread is by no means as good as their bread, but something about making it at home for myself and for Scott and us sharing it is like, it's unbeatable.
So the year that I started baking, I think work was very intense and stressful. And so it really afforded me an opportunity to say, well, no, I need to make this space and time to just be at home, potter around, be able to attend to the dough every so often when it's required. You know, always being a person who's really busy and doing things all the time was quite a gift. And I have been known to say, I've got to go home to deal with my dough. The first year I baked bread, I probably baked at least 1, if not 3, loaves every week to practice. There was a lot I had to figure out on my own, like when is the right time, like for, say, for it to be shaped, or if it's proofed enough, if it's underproofed, is it overproofed. So that part of it, I guess, was hard, but I also, maybe the nerd in me, the obsessive person in me, enjoyed that. Oh, aren't you cute? Sorry, I do this thing on Instagram, usually because it's like such a long process. I entertain myself by taking pictures of the dough and then drawing faces on them. Oh, aren't you cute? Most people do is just take a small amount of the starter and feed it fresh. Then whatever's remaining is commonly called the discard. When I started and I was baking so regularly, I had a lot of discard, and it just felt like such a waste just to simply throw it away. So I've always kept it. I have a tub of discard in my fridge all the time. Sometimes there's more than one tub. And I just found different things to make with it. You know, you can add it to your pancake batter, your waffle batter, bake crumpets with it, crackers, pastry. Those things turn out equally delicious. I could never eat as much as I bake, so I really enjoy sharing it with friends and family and colleagues. There's a great delight, I think, in creating something that other people enjoy. My favourite part of the process is halfway through the bake, opening that pot lid and seeing what happened.
It's that first reveal of seeing that bread just puff up.
And it's still a little pale because it hasn't, been browned yet.
And your score lines are starting to open and you might see a little bit of an ear forming. I feel like I'm not that attached to my starters, but I give them names. So maybe I am attached to my starter. My favourite starter is called Mabel. It becomes a bit of an obsession. You are feeding your starter every day and you're watching it grow, and some days it doesn't grow as much and you're like, what's wrong with my starter? I have had a lot of starters that have not worked as well, and it's really upsetting when that happens.
Sometimes you'll pull it out and it will be a bit black on the top if you leave it for a few weeks, and you can just kind of scoop that off and refresh it. But it can get to a point like my starter was sitting at this spot in the fridge that was maybe close to some cheese, and they just started sharing bacteria, and this starter, I could not revive it without it smelling like camembert. So yeah, I'd chuck that one out.
Yeah, I remember that one of the first loaves I made was really firm and very sour. And I called it Forever Bread because I was determined to finish eating it. So I think I ate it over 10 days. It just just didn't seem to ever end.
There's some extreme lows of home baking would be setting a day aside to make a loaf of bread, putting it in the fridge overnight, maybe telling your mates you can't catch up that afternoon because you're going to make a loaf of bread or something, and then coming home, putting the oven on for an hour, putting it in, and after half an hour pulling the lid off your cast iron pot and realising that there's just a pancake in there and something horribly wrong has gone.
Something goes wrong and it's not that great, I'll still eat it, I'll still enjoy it, and I'll remind myself that tomorrow's another day. I've got another opportunity to make another loaf.
Every mistake you make is an edible mistake.
It's a constant virtuous circle of reassessing what you're making and trying to improve the next little bit. Once you go through that and you learn those hard lessons, you appreciate when it works. You appreciate every time it works that, yep, I didn't have to learn that lesson again. I paid my price.
I think the appreciation and your gratitude is far greater when you know the process.
Yeah, I definitely would encourage people to at least have a go at making bread, just to get an understanding of how the amount of work that goes into it, and to see something that you eat nearly every single day, how it's made. Once you've made bread, you can go into a shop and sort of like realise how legitimate they are about making bread.
Sometimes I'm shocked people don't charge more, knowing how much time goes into it. But then I can also understand why people would be shocked and say, I'm not paying that much for bread, you know, because like a basic sandwich white loaf can cost you $1 from a local supermarket.
The idea of spending $10 on a loaf, like a lot of people just wouldn't do it, but at the same time, it's like if you knew what really went into that loaf, you would spend $10 in a heartbeat.
There's so many costs that go into making what we do. And I think the truth is the time is probably the biggest one.
It's not something that you can dump all the ingredients into a machine and the machine spits this dough out and then it goes into a dough divider and then it spits out perfect 900 gram bits of dough, and all you got to do is a quick little shape. Or even some of these commercial bakeries, they have a machine that does everything from beginning to end, even shape the bread. Everything we do here is by hand, from the mixing stages to the folds and to the pre-shaping to the final shaping to cutting into that bread before it hits the oven. It's all hand done. It's done by people like me and our bakers.
If you think of a bottle of wine, we don't mind paying $100 even, or $50 for a bottle of wine, but it's the same thing. It's the same process. There's not more work or more skill or in wine than in bread if bread is made properly.
We try to source the best flour we can find, Australian grown, organic, supporting the farmers. Everything is done with intentionality, because you get something like $1 or $2 loaf from a grocery store, which has 25 plus ingredients in it and makes you feel sick after you've eaten it. I don't think there's a comparison there. It's cheap because it's cheaply made.
It might seem disproportionate until you factor in that, well, one is not going to sustain your life for that long, or it's not going to give you a very good life. The other one is going to give you much better energy levels, macronutrients. Suddenly the double of the price really isn't that big a deal.
The price that we kind of charge for our bread is, we think it's fair. $1 per 100 grams is pretty reasonable, I think.
I thought I want to make a bread where I can charge $10. That was a lot these days. Everyone said, you are crazy, you can't do that. Then we made it all with a special shape and a different size, which is not so common. I think it should cost $10 or $15 in general. Then you will get more young people who want to become bakers and get not only the pride of it, also get the money for it.
Our business will employ 2 or 3 times as many people at a much higher rate of pay than a factory. So yes, the factory is more efficient, and yes, it'll feed more people, and there's a need for that. But there's a next order need as well for not just to be fed, but to be nourished, both in terms of the body, but in terms of the community as well, because the community need jobs, they need employment, they need local work, not to have to travel long distances to get work.
To be honest, I never saw a career as a baker. We went through a season where we kind of started discovering ourselves and realizing that Once we started having kids, we didn't want our kids growing up thinking that food just came from the grocery store and it just came in a plastic bag. We started growing our own produce and kind of dabbled in cheese making and making beer and a few things like that, and the only missing piece was bread.
Wash me clean and make me into something new.
What I've been told about making sourdough bread at home, it was like this lengthy process and it was going to be difficult and sticky and wet, and it just required a lot of time and patience. I often, when I get a task, I've got to get it done, I've got to do it as quick as possible, but you can't do that with bread. It's a lengthy process. I'd say if you include the starter feed, you're looking at, 30 to 40 hours from start to finish, but if you count it from when I start mixing, so you're looking at about 24 to 30 hours before the bread is completed.
See the beauty in this life and life alone. I take it on with the sun and rain, and you I know I'll grow.
Being a baker, it's hard work. It's probably some of the hardest work I've ever done. It is so labor intensive. It's long hours, early hours.
So if it's a hot summer day and you have that wood-fired oven, at least 4 hours, mostly in front of that oven, get bread in, bread out, next in, next out, that can be very hard. When I was a kid, it was still a regular flour bag was 100 kilo, and they carried that. I don't know how they did it. That getting this dough out of the bowl, you lift that up and it's all like this.
Lugging around, 40 kilos of dough and flour sacks, and you're picking it up and tipping it into the mixer.
But we built the bakery in 3 levels so that we can use gravity to minimize that hard bit of the work. If you have to have 150 loaves done ready to go in the oven, you can't play. It is really very physical, very organized work. Otherwise, the first is already proven like this, and the last is that little, and then there's no point. You have to be quick.
Oh, that's really hot. It's all right. Some calluses. Because being a baker can be quite an isolating job, because you're often, in a room, with just yourself or another person or a couple of people, and I think having that space where, you can have people interacting with you and saying g'day and saying, how are you, checking in on you, and I think it's super important. Mental health is, I think it's quite a taboo topic, really. And I myself went through a really bad mental health year last year, and just was in my own head for far too long, and didn't know how to talk and didn't know how to kind of get how I was feeling out and be able to talk to somebody.
It can be quite isolating if you allow it to be.
As I walk alone through crowded streets, it gets hard to see it, hard to breathe, yeah, fall down right.
It's pretty tough. On a Wednesday, I'll come home from TAFE at about 2:30, 3 o'clock, and I'll probably have dinner and go to bed at about 5. And wake up at 12 so I can actually wake up before coming into work rather than crawling in here dead. It puts a real dent in your social life, I suppose, because no one really works these hours, so all of my friends, they'd finish work at 5 when I'd be getting ready to go to bed. So, a bit tough, but what can you do?
the baker is really, he's always the guy who is tired and who can't be part of the social life. And if you're young, it's pretty tough. And if you take part in the social life, then you are so tired at work. If you make good bread, then it's good the next day. If you make it in the afternoon or in the late morning, it's good the whole day and the next day and another day. So we start at 7, and we are there till 6. There is no need for night shifts.
And we come up against this a lot, is that there's a stigma. Oh, you work in a bakery. I tell people I own a bakery. Oh, that's nice. But they don't value it. There's almost a sympathetic response to it rather than a proud response. Oh, I'm speaking to somebody of worthiness. It's kind of like, oh, you poor thing. Like, where did you go wrong in your life? And they don't feel that way about their job. But that's the sense that they get, that community spirit, that community response is almost sympathy rather than respect. And yet when they're in the workplace, they get all the things that they enjoy. They get human connection, they get a good wage, they get satisfaction from what they're doing.
And it's kind of like a joke that people always make is like, oh, I could not be a baker. Like, could not do the early mornings, but yeah. Roll out of bed at 8 o'clock in the morning and just roll into the bakery and grab a loaf of bread and take it home is the simplest act. And yet, you know, someone has made the sacrifice of maybe not seeing their friends or family as much and sleep and that sort of thing just to bring this product to the community.
And one of the reasons why I think baking on site rather than central manufacturing, distributing through a network of vehicles to lots of satellite stores, one of the things that you lose when you follow that model is gratitude. That baker gets to hear, not so much in words, they get to see it in body language, that the customer is grateful, that this is the loaf of bread that I've made for them. They get to see that thank you. We put in big glass windows so they can see it because they work all through the night or whatever shift they're doing. They see a few customers in the morning, they see happy people, they're doing something right. It's not just working for a wage or providing for their family, they're providing for other families too. And there's an unspoken trust in all of that, yeah, I'll put in my best for that.
But it is, yeah, it's hard, but it's here, the way it's here, and also these new artisan bakeries, it's so rewarding. In Europe, it's more common. People want their bread. But here, we have always people coming and say, thanks for doing that. They always reward you and are happy that someone is doing their job for you.
It's not easy work, but it's rewarding. It's a creative outlet for me. Just kind of think of the flavor combinations, or I can almost taste it without tasting it. I've got plenty of ideas. I just gotta not do them all at once, you know.
I suppose it depends if you know, how you go about anything. So if you want to rush and get the hell out of here, or if you just take your time and try and enjoy the process, it's a nice job. It's actually been really nice to kind of work with your hands and try and learn as you go along.
I do enjoy the feel of the dough itself, also to see how simple ingredients come together. and that something that simple can create something extremely tasty. And if I create something like that, yeah, it makes me happy.
There's hardly any food what you don't wash or cook or peel. We take the bread from the shelf, put it in the bag, give it to the people. They take it and start eating on the way out of the bakery. So there's total trust that this is clean and properly done. I think that's a lot of trust. And if you think what trust is amongst people, trust is probably the most worthy thing what you can have.
My wife Chrissy and I opened a little gourmet shop in Perth in 1991, and part of that was making bread. And it just sort of grew from there. Sort of going to New Norcia was an accident, but we went there in 1991 to buy some olive oil from the monks and found out that they had a beautiful old 120-year-old wood-fired oven in the monastery, and we put a proposal to them that we'd be allowed to use that to bake our sourdough bread. We thought the market for the bread was going to be in New Norcia from the people who visit there, but it wasn't. The market was here in Perth, 134 kilometres away. And I spent the next 3 years driving to New Norcia every night to bake bread and then driving back in the morning to bring the bread back to Perth. So as far as I know, we were the only people making sourdough bread in Perth at that time. There was sort of continental loaves, people like Vastisi making Italian, what they call Italian loaves, but there was nobody making sourdough. Barrett's came along about a year after us, and now there's sourdough bakeries all over Perth.
Yeah, we opened Need 2.5 years ago. So yeah, so. Yeah, man. Yeah, I really love it. It is the best job I've ever done.
I really don't know what the next generation are going to offer. I think that's what's really exciting, is that you just don't know what corner they're going to turn around, what they're going to bring to the equation. Whether that's in terms of the ingredients that they choose to offer up to the customers through more sustainable farming practices, supporting local growers and millers, or whether that's through new techniques or new equipment that they manage to get their hands on.
It's kind of like this game of constantly raising the bar to like what is the new standard of like operations. You know, years ago you just have like the classic bakery with a tin loaf and a tiger loaf, and now like the standard, you know, is to have a selection of different types of sourdough, to be, you know, milling using freshly milled grains or milling them yourself, knowing where the flour comes from.
There's always more, there's always people trying new things, and like I say, going back to basics with milling your own flour. So you've kind of got both ends of it. You can reinvent from the start. And obviously with gluten-free and everything like that coming in, there's still endless opportunities, and I'm sure people will still be continuing to reinvent with new flours and new techniques, and it will continue to grow.
A lot more sort of people who maybe were just a home baker can now sort of venture out and hone in the craft and open a bakery of their own, and there will always be, you know, a market for that.
My name is Rebecca Khan, and this is Sally's Micro Bakery. A micro bakery, the way I interpret it, is like a little cottage bakery. So you've got your bakery set up in your house, and you do all the mixing and baking from your home. You're more one-on-one, so you get that personalised touch with your customers, and you get more of a personalised touch with your suppliers as well. So this process I usually do on a Sunday morning, so when I first wake up. I will wake up, depending how many loaves I need to make, either 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, preheat the oven for 2 hours, and then I'll probably just go back to bed, which is a major perk of having your own micro bakery. So once the oven's preheated, then I load up the sourdough. Once it's all baked, I let it cool down for a bit, wrap it up, package it, and then pop it in my car. And then I'll just spend a couple of hours just driving around Perth and delivering my bread to people. I like the idea of keeping it small, connected and personalised, so I can still go out and meet my customers. Who wouldn't love fresh bread dropped off to their house on a Sunday morning? Just like the old days where you'd get the milkman, drop off the milk to your front door. It's kind of like a little bit nostalgic like that in a way, I guess.
Bakeries are, by definition, retail baking, you can't have a big net. It must be small, it must be local. Otherwise, you're not relevant. South Freo is an interesting place. It's very eclectic. There's a lot of different characters and personalities here. Things just fell into place here. We lived nearby. We found a kitchen that we could transform into a space for a bakery. And most importantly, we found customers here. Without that, there is no business, there is no bakery, there is nothing to share without someone to participate in it. Whilst I own the bakery, I give ownership of the bakery and its destiny to the customers. We offer up ideas. It's up to them to take hold of it and say, yes, we want more.
Yeah, so Miller Baker, when we chose to position it here, we just wanted to, I suppose, be able to provide good products to the local community. So good bread, healthier bread than hopefully they would get from a lot of other places. And also then offer excellent coffee and pastries and all the products as locally sourced as we can possibly get them. And also offer them like freshly milled flour.
When we started planning Need, we just wanted it to be a welcoming space. We intentionally set it up so that there's no barrier between the customer and the baker. We wanted it to be a space where you knew your baker, you knew your barista. We've got 4 kids who are all very eager to get in here and work, and yeah, I think they're all quite proud of it. When people see Need, I want them to see my family, because if it wasn't for my family, Need wouldn't be here.
The Yelling Up community is really special. I always had the feeling in Yelling Up this is a community of soul sisters and brothers or like-minded people where you don't know each other really, but you walk past and you think we are on the same page or so. This is nice about Yelling Up.
Bakeries have a really unique position in the community in gathering people and bringing a sense of commonality. You know, like lots of people eat bread, lots of people need bread. Relationally, when they connect, there's already a baseline like, oh my gosh, how good is the bread here?
A good bakery is like a hub for the community. People can gather, you get to see the baker that has made the bread. You get to experience that bread, you get to have a conversation with that baker if you're lucky. you get to watch everybody else eating all of the delicious baked goods.
They kind of become these like cult favourite places that go beyond their communities, you know. Tourists will come and say, oh, I've heard, you know, back home in my home country that if I come to Perth, I have to go to these bakeries and try them. It is a way of also giving the community a sense of pride. What a bakery can produce can be of such great reputation as well. And so it's nice to think that the thing that we enjoy day in, day out, other people have heard about and have come to try.
We should be very proud of the bakers we have here, and even people milling their own flour like Miller and Baker. There are not many places in the country that do that. We're producing bread, you know, as good as anywhere. So yeah, we should be very proud, and being as small as we are, we should be embracing that.
Much like going out for a really lovely dinner and experiencing food that is cooked for you with intention and with thought and with heart, I think the same could be said for a good bakery.
I can't think of the amount of times that I've gone to bakery and bought something to give to somebody just to brighten their day. It's something that facilitates our social connection, for sure.
The best bakers I've ever seen are artisan bakers who are absolutely passionate about what they do, and it comes through in the bread.
I think people will come back to that whole, I'm doing this with my hands, I'm doing it out of love. This is why this bread tastes so good.
I think it's just the nicest act of love or caring that you can do for another human being is feed them. The reason I wanted to bake bread was I wanted to make people happy, and if they were happy eating it, then I'd done the job.
The truth is, you go in and out of enthusiasm for subjects, all subjects in your life. But when you just are in your own mind and you're in your own peace, yeah, I'm still nuts for it because it's magic.
Hello? Hello? Which song should I do? How loud is it? If I sing loudly, is it going to hurt your ears? Mr. Bombastic? Shaggy? Wait, what about some Johnny Cash?
And then just like use my little shower cut buddy. Reusable.
What's this? What's that?
He's a good boy.
Here's the door. Yeah, it's the door for, and it's bizarre because when you're here by yourself in the middle of the night or in early mornings, you hear this clunk and you think, oh shit, someone's trying to get in. There you go. Very good, Cedric. I think we used that. Yeah, there you go.
Maybe 4.5 years ago, I started trying to make my own sourdough bread, and it was terrible. The first few loaves were just bricks, and my wife, bless her, she ate so much bad bread for so long.
Can you give me a little clap, please? Perfect.
Just the one.